have an incredible episode with a returning guest telling us her raw story on how to come back from infidelity. And if you know anyone that's struggling with cheating or an emotional disconnection or healing, this is for you. I promise this is going to completely change your perspective and help you with greater understanding and wisdom as you or family members move forward with similar struggles. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Fulfillment Therapy. Today we have an incredible returning guest, my sister, Abbie Tait. About a year ago, you came on and you talked about deep wounds. Just a little background onto this. My sister and I were talking about some challenges that I have had recently with some clients, serving them in the way that I want to, especially when it comes to infidelity and disconnection in marriage. And my sister had some insights because of her own journey. She spoke to this a little bit in episode, I believe it was 167, if you want to go check that out. And I wanted to have her back on. And the reason that I love having Abbie on is it's hard with other podcast guests to get to that space where it can be really open and raw and vulnerable because of our relationship and because of Abbie's personality. It's very easy to go there like you can't with a stranger. And she was willing to come on. So thank you, Abbie, for coming on the show again.
Yeah.
So like I said, you came on the podcast about a year ago. You shared a story about overcoming those deep wounds. And one of those was your divorce, which ended due to infidelity, which you talked about before. And for listeners that may not know about that part of your story, can you summarize a little bit of what happened and what led to that turning point for you?
Yeah. Hopefully I don't end up like repeating myself from other things that I said, but my story still kind of remains the same. Some points will obviously be repeating. It was definitely no lack of love. I always loved my husband, and I would say to this day that I still love him and care for him very much. But I was pretty lonely. He is a man of many hobbies, and he's also very driven, and he tends to focus on one thing at a time. And we were married 15 years. The majority of that time he was in school. We had 4 children, and a lot of that responsibility fell on me because he was very focused on school. I think as a lot of young families, we didn't have a lot of time for connection. That in combination with my own childhood trauma, which I feel a little embarrassed to say that because it feels like cliche. Everyone has their stuff. There just became more and more disconnection. I was used to parenting alone. I was used to not having a partner around. And I am someone who really does require a lot of emotional connection to feel safe and to feel seen and cared for. And I didn't feel that I had that in my marriage. And throughout our marriage, there were plenty of opportunities where I could have been unfaithful, but I had no interest in that. I was so in love with my husband. But I think the perfect storm of events, and then you insert this other person at this point in which I was really vulnerable. I was questioning my faith, and I was emotionally giving up hope that I would ever be the priority to my husband. And then this man came along that seemed really interested in who I was as a person and seemed to want to know me more than anything. And I fell into that because it felt really good and really exciting to have someone take a real interest in me.
I'm glad that you're speaking to that because that is something that so many of my clients talk about, like not feeling seen or heard or valued. And then these clients talk about how good it feels to just finally have that. And it feels like when they first started dating, or even more so if they didn't, maybe it's been long enough that they don't even remember those feelings. And such a stark contrast, especially when you have young kids and there's craziness all around and you just don't really feel valued in this stage of life nearly as much anymore. I know in that previous episode that we did speak to a lot of these things. And just a quick disclaimer here, I do want to point out that I deeply love your now ex, and I want to be respectful of his story too. And obviously, he would have his own take on all of this. But these are common problems for so many married people. And what do we do about it? And how does that disconnection then lead to other things that are difficult to come back from and continue to have these natural consequences that can ruin lives? And that's an aspect we didn't speak of in our last episode that you're very passionate about, and I want to focus on in this episode specifically, but this background is necessary for that. If you could tell us next steps, just tell us briefly that story about how that guy reached out to you, what happened, and that internal battle, and how that can apply to other people too.
One of the first things I can remember is it started out as just kind of banter, joking, very light flirtation. And even initially, like my husband at the time had pointed out, like, oh, that's a really good looking guy. And we like laughed about it. And early on, too, I remember feeling this intrigue, but at the same time, I also felt this slight fear. If I look back, it's obvious to me that there were like alarms going off in my body. And there was this feeling of, I almost couldn't tell the difference between intrigue and fear, if that makes sense. And I would talk pretty openly about my discomfort with him, with my husband. But I think what kind of drew me in was I remember there was a book that I was reading, and this man he was the warranty guy on our house that we had built. And so there was a lot of interaction with him and I because there was things around the house that needed to be finished or altered because we moved into this house that we had built. We had to communicate over these things. And he saw a book that I was reading. And a few days later, he had come to me with all these questions. And I asked him, did you read this book? And he's like, yeah, I saw that you were reading it. And I thought maybe you could help me like understand you because you said that it was a really emotional book for you to read. It was one of Glennon Doyle's books. But anyway, he had read the book and taken notes and came to me with these questions. And that was really impactful for me because I wanted my husband to have a desire to understand me and to know me more than anything. And oddly enough, that desire still exists to this day. Even though we're divorced, there's still this part of me that just wishes that he had and still would have some sort of desire to actually know who I am. So for this man to do that for me was like, it hit a spot in me that I knew that I craved those things, but it was just really impactful. And he seemed to want to know me more than anything I'd ever experienced before. Like he had so many questions and that just felt really good. And I think that was the beginning of me falling for him in an emotional way. And there was a strong attraction there. But again, these red flags kept flashing, but it was clouded by the fact that I was being seen, or at least that this man wanted to see me.
So there were like these early danger signs. And again, talking about these clients that I have, what about for other people that might have that similar situation? Maybe they feel that emotional disconnect, like you felt, maybe they have that same intrigue or that fear, and they're starting to connect with somebody else. Maybe it's still that space that you're telling in your story where it feels pretty innocent. How can they recognize that they're on dangerous ground? And I want to go into what happened next, but where would you say with this part? What would you recommend?
Well, the obvious ones, if you feel any sort of feeling like you need to censor any sort of conversations or that you would be uncomfortable if your partner were right there next to you and observing the way you're interacting, I think those are obvious signs that you should potentially avoid. I wish looking back, I had a lot of conversations with my ex-husband about interactions with this other man, but I wish that I had just been brave enough to say, hey, I find that I'm really enjoying this attention from him. The weird thing is that I have actually had those conversations with my ex-husband before when men would approach me or say things and I would tell him like, hey, I felt good to have their attention, but I know I only want that attention from you. It didn't really seem to go anywhere, at least for me in that situation. But looking back, I still think it would have been very beneficial to say, hey, I find myself attracted to this man. He's giving me a lot of extra attention. That feels really good. I think that this could potentially be a bad situation. What should we do about it? I think just being honest, like being brave enough to be honest, like really honest, because you're giving your partner now the opportunity to like, connect with you in a way that you have been lacking. So it could deepen your relationship. It can have a huge impact on the way that you can trust each other, which also will deepen intimacy. But also, you're taking away the secret. Because I think a big part of this is when you have a shared secret with someone. So, like the secret that I had with this other man, that sucks us into the fantasy. And that's a big part of the intoxication of just the secret itself. So, once you're able to speak that secret out loud to the person that you are like really keeping it from, the main person, you're killing it in its tracks.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you spoke to that because so many people don't even get to that part or don't have that awareness of that. Like that's the way to stop it in its tracks or change it. And ideally, you could do it ahead of time. But what about those listeners that are like, but I like the way this feels. I like to feel seen. I like to feel heard. I trust myself. And they're like justifying it. I just want to be appreciated. I'm not going to do anything about it. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say none of those things are wrong, but if you're able to justify it in that way, then why are you so afraid to talk about it with someone you actually care about? Because that alone is evidence that you're justifying your own behavior and you don't even believe it yourself. Because if you really believed it yourself, you wouldn't hesitate to talk about that truthfully. And I think that it is really scary. Like, my number one fear when I was going through this was, what if I don't end up with either of them? And that's exactly what happened. And I knew it would happen. I knew it would. And I'm okay now, but for a long time, I didn't think I would be. I believe my ex-husband and I could have worked it out. I believed we loved each other enough that we could have worked it out if I had been brave enough to be really honest. And if I had given him the opportunity to work through that with me and to show him I could be trustworthy, but I was still also human with a lot of unmet needs. I just didn't even give any of that a real chance because I didn't give him the opportunity to respond in any other way than what he did.
I am so grateful, Abby, that you are speaking to this in a way that like you're obviously so humble about it and have at this point, and I can't speak to before, but very brave now in sharing this and what you did and didn't do, taking accountability for your part. And I know a lot of people aren't in that space. I feel like it is really important to hear that last step, even those that have listened to your journey before. If you could take us through what happened next, and because I want to apply that to what you said, because you did say your biggest fear is that what if I don't end up with either of them? I hear that from a lot of my clients. And so they avoid doing anything because they don't want to lose either one, which essentially then makes them lose both in the end anyway. So, yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing what happened next, and then I'll come back to these questions I have for clients.
The affair just escalated and it was intoxicating. It was exciting. It felt like I had all the passion and the attention that I craved in my marriage. Throughout all of this, there was never a point at which I didn't love my husband anymore. And I did feel there were moments of crushing anxiety of what have I gotten myself into? And I can't get out now. Like, I'm too far in. But when I was with this other man, it felt like we were in our own world, which to me is just an indication of fantasy. We disappeared into this space where it was just us. There was no accountability. There was no responsibility. It was just acting purely on desire. And that it was a high. And I now can see that it was absolutely an addiction. He was my drug. And I see now that there is no way. I don't know that anyone could give me a single example of someone who has lived successfully on a constant high. So I think that's one way to determine fantasy, whether you're in a fantasy or not, is lasting real relationships aren't going to be that constant high. I had like reality in my marriage and my children and my family. And then with this other man, I had this fantasy and it felt really good to escape to. But our affair escalated. It became sexual, and there was a lot of talk of the future and what do we do, and realizing that we felt very emotionally connected. And I started to question like what I wanted. Did I want my marriage anymore? Did I want to pursue this? Like, it was easy to believe that it was possible to have that all the time.
Yeah.
even though I think I knew I couldn't. But ultimately, my ex-husband found out. There was a lot of trauma around that. He had hired a private investigator, and ultimately, he approached me. We talked. We separated for about a year. We were back and forth on whether or not we should get divorced. We weren't signing the papers. I had moved out, and this other man was in and out of the picture constantly. He was a very hard man to get away from, and I was very confused, and I knew that I wanted to save my marriage and save my family, but I was also afraid of leaning into that because I thought that there was no way my husband could forgive me. So it felt like this other man was the safer option of, at least he won't leave me, and I don't think my husband will ever forgive me. And so I more leaned into that, and I tried to make it work. We ultimately got divorced, my husband, and I tried to make this relationship work with this other man for 6 years. And he became very abusive, and I felt like I had to make it work because it's what I chose. And I also think I was punishing myself. I felt like I had deserved it because of that's what I chose. And so I had to accept that what it was. And I tried everything in hopes of thinking there has to be a way we can build something healthy out of something that started this way. But personally, don't believe that is possible. I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen. I'm sure there are some success stories with couples who have started in affairs, but that's not my story. And about a year and a half ago or so, I finally was able to like really end things, and I'm completely done with that now. But that's a really quick summary.
You hit so many of those important points that speak to people, clients that I've had, listeners, where you talked about it being in your own world, this fantasy. There's no accountability, just desire. It doesn't reflect what life is really. It was just this high, this addiction. And that's exactly the wording that my clients use. Like it does feel exactly like an addiction. And you've told me about this before, but if you wouldn't mind speaking to this briefly about how you almost felt like you needed to escape from his grasp, his clutches, like step away, that might have helped. Can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah. I have obviously spent a lot of time looking back and thinking, how could things have been different? What would have helped? I know it's complex and some of it probably not even fair, but my wish is that my family and loved ones had just removed me from the situation because I don't believe I was in a healthy enough state of mind to make those decisions. Just as if you had a family member who was a drug addict, you can't really give them the option of whether they can have the drug or not. They're not in a position that they can resist it. And I wish that I had been removed as if going to a rehab or something where there was actual space and time away from him so I could come back to myself and see things more clearly. Because again, I think I could have saved my marriage. I think I could have saved my family. And there are no words to express the amount of pain and heaviness and guilt that I feel every single day because of the impact that I've had on my children and my ex-husband and his family and the people who meant the very most to me because I fell into something that felt really great at the moment, but I had no perspective on the impact that it would leave on my entire life and the people that I live for.
As hard as that is, you can hear it. You can see it if you're watching. You can hear it in your voice. And watching you go through that was painful to see. There's like natural consequences of, like you said, being caught up in that fantasy and not really knowing the end result, but just like living in this thing that felt so good and in the beginning pretty innocent. And it came from this space of just wanting to be seen and heard and valued, very natural, normal desires. But because of those steps that you took, like how many lives it impacted, and I'm not saying this to heap on the shame or guilt or anything like that, but for other people that might be walking that path. And as we were talking the other night, that same thing, how you even got emotional then talking about if I could share anything with them, it would be sharing your story, talking about these things so that they know that this fantasy can't continue. And this might be a good point. You brought it up already, but I did look up some statistics and I'll share some of those now. If an affair is kept secret, only about 20% of those marriages survive beyond 5 years. And this is what you spoke to. Fewer than 2% of relationships that start as affairs endure beyond 2 years. So if you choose to go with that person that you're having an affair with. So fewer than 2%, that is not much. And individuals who have cheated are about 3 times more likely to cheat again. Couples recovering from infidelity within their original relationship show that 60 to 75% of those couples stay together long term. Like you said, I feel like I could have saved that marriage. So if you can recover from that and work through it, they're able to, obviously, with therapy and different things, owning things, accountability, all of that. There's almost like this affair fog that can create, you did speak to this, that addictive feeling, that intense connection, and thing that's built on that deception makes sustaining that trust, that emotional safety, and that intimacy so difficult, as I'm sure that you will probably speak to. But that betrayal also leads to ongoing emotional and social consequences. Again, like you spoke to, such as damaged reputations, guilt, instability, family struggles, like connection with your children, all of those things. Abbie, do you have any thoughts about those things and your own experience going through that?
Yes. I think about different personality traits and character and how a lot of those statistics make sense to me and I'm not surprised by them, but how there are a lot of different layers to things. So there's not going to be an absolute truth for anything. In my current relationship, that has been a fear. His story includes some infidelity that he was the victim of. So, of course, there's naturally going to be a fear that because I've already done this once, statistically speaking, I'm likely to do it again. And that's a hard statistic to be up against because I know that this is not a part of who I am. This is very outside of my character.
That actually goes well into what I was going to ask you. You've alluded to several of those things, but the ongoing consequences, because we want listeners to really know what the reality is, not the fantasy, but the reality. And as heart wrenching as it is, I've seen you go through so many of these things, but I only have a small inkling of what that really feels like. Could you speak to that if you're willing, of those natural consequences that occurred after that relationship ended, or maybe even throughout?
Yeah. So I hurt a lot of people with my choices, mostly my children. They have been, and I'm amazed with their ability to forgive and to love and to accept. However, I was their dad wasn't ever really around. I took care of them. I did. My whole life was them. And it almost feels like those 15 years don't really matter now because of what I did, that it interfered with the depth of my relationship with them. And they leaned more into their father, which is okay. Like, he's a great dad. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it almost feels like I am more of an outsider of my own family now. And no matter how much I work on myself, no matter how much I try to my wrongs, I can't undo it. And I have very open dialogue with my children around this, but there are still things that will come up that I never would have thought would be a problem. And it's not that they have a hard time forgiving or letting go. It just affects the relationship and you can't undo it. And I feel like for the rest of my life, I am going to be feeling the consequences of those choices no matter what I do. I fairly recently had a very long conversation with my son because I could tell he would come home and he would just go upstairs or he was on his phone. And he wasn't mean to me or anything, but I felt like there was a lack of a deeper connection. So I got pretty emotional one night and we had a long talk in my bedroom. And I just said, "This is how I'm feeling." He was treating me similarly to how his dad treated me, and I didn't realize how much of a trigger that would be. It's not something that I had considered, that my own son would treat me in ways that would trigger these wounds that I had in my marriage. And so I talked with him about that, and he got quiet, and I was like, "Anything you'd want to share?" And I feel like when you divorced dad, you divorced me too. And I was shocked and hurt. But at the same time, I just said, okay, that makes sense. Can you tell me more? And he really opened up about how he wasn't angry with me, but he didn't really understand. He's like, I don't think I'm mad at you, but I'm also not sure if I've fully forgiven you. And it's just easier for me to relate with dad. And I feel awkward with you. And like some of my worst fears he was expressing. And I just asked him, I was like, is this something you want to improve on? Is this something you want to like work through with me? And he said yes. And then we just talked for a few hours and things have gotten better. But I've checked in a few times. I'm like, how are things feeling? Do you feel a little closer to me? Do you feel less awkward? And he was like, yeah, mostly. And he's a teenage boy. And I understand that a lot of that is normal. But that is really painful. And that's just one example of just so many things that are not worth the price I paid. Like, I would give anything to have been braver and just more honest. And if I could avoid all of this, because it has shaken my entire world for years and years.
I feel like I'm a broken record here, like continuing to say thank you, but I genuinely mean it. How many people would come on a podcast and publicly share that they've had an affair and the natural consequences of that decision and all the things that have happened as a result of that? Like, super raw, very brave. And my heart just like aches for you because I know so many people feel these things that are either in a similar situation or just can relate to some aspects of your story. But like, yeah, just feeling like that ache, that loneliness you likely feel, especially when you said it's like that 15 years almost didn't matter. All that work that you put in, that exhaustion, those long nights, those lonely days, like all of those things. And how it was, I don't want to say gone, but it felt largely gone because of this moment of weakness that then when you move forward, you felt like you couldn't come back from. You felt like there was nothing you could do at that point. Thanks, my friends, for listening to part 1 of this episode. Don't forget to check out part 2 to finish Abbie's story and insights that you won't want to miss. Check out fulfillmenttherapy.org for our courses, our coaching, and so much more. You can sign up for our email list so you don't miss any of those things that can help you take your personal and family life to the next level in ways you can't achieve on your own. Share this episode with your friends so it can help others that are struggling with similar situations. I'll see you back here soon for part 2.